sunlight, 7 days on fire. Primarch slice, ready to inspire. Got a new mission, they're on the go. Catching Pokemon, a legendary show.
Hi, my name is Sio, and I want to take you on an adventure into the world of Pokemon. But this may be a bit more grim than you're used to. While I've no doubt everyone knows what Pokemon is, something a little more esoteric is the community of Pokemon ROM hacks. ROM hacks are usually edits of existing video games, where things like graphics, music, gameplay, and even cutscenes are added or modified. These are created from love of the base game and are, to my knowledge, entirely free to play online. I've had the pleasure to enjoy quite a few of them. I love to make things, and in my continuous struggle towards becoming a modern-day Renaissance man, I had the urge to create my own. Writing this, I thought I just had the idea, but looking at old communications with friends about it, it seems I started working on it in the later half of 2021. Dear God, where does the time go? Anyway, being a pretty big 40k enthusiast, I thought this was the perfect opportunity to meld my passions. There are about 18 Primarchs and 18 Pokemon creature types, so it was just begging for a Primarch as gym leader type game. Now the basic plot of the game is you start off as a neophyte, organs freshly implanted. There are 2 ways I considered doing it. The first was to have a neophyte go from flagship of each of the Primarchs, leveling up and battling until they work through all 18. Then eventually they go to Terra, for some reason, whatever. Battling increasingly hard Custodes until they face the Emperor. For this, I considered creating 18 separate Pokemon party lists for each Primarch so that you can challenge them in any order you wanted, but by the time you got to the Emperor, it was hard enough for endgame, so you didn't have to worry. Side note, this ends up being like 300 different sets of Pokemon battle parties. It probably be a nightmare, but I'm pretty sure I can make some sort of automated system to just generate them for me. I also considered having a fun questionnaire, like a personality type quiz to see which legion you would be in, and it would give you the first Pokemon starter based on it. The second way I considered was that in this universe, as part of your psycho indoctrination and conditioning, each neophyte goes through mental trials to see which legion they were best suited to enter. They were given a few to choose from, maybe some questions there, and that would determine what 3 Pokemon you get, and then you go through a traditional Pokemon experience. By the time you were done collecting your badges, purity seals or something, you would then be brought out with your Pokemon and have to fight the actual Primarchs for real in the endgame. While I've yet to start outside of poking around through some of the engines, I thought it would still make a pretty cool series of videos going into Pokemon each Primarch would have. For the game, I think initially they would have Pokemon strictly of their type, but once you hit post-game, I think they would have 3 different parties. 1 would be their type, same as the main game. 2 would be what I think reflects their personality in Legion, and 3 would be what I think they would use in a meta-competitive build, how each of them would go about taking battling seriously, and I think this might reflect somewhat of how they go to war. In this video, we'll go into which type each Primarch would rep as a gym leader and why, and let me tell you, this is a far more involved question than it appears at first glance. This was my first impulse, but upon further inspection it became far more convoluted and turned into a big conspiracy board with red lines across the Primarchs and types with pros and cons for each. As a preface going in, I considered aesthetic, cultural context, Pokemon pool, and general stat distribution of each type against the Primarchs, their legion, their aesthetic, and symbolic representation. As a rule, I didn't look too much into type matching, strictly because that would get too much into the Pokemon battle meta, and this is mostly about thematic symbolism, just like the Warp. The pairings broke up into 3 categories: easy assignment, middle of the road / falling into place, and contentious. And dear God, how contentious it is. To not, just hand wave away the easy categories, I'll be going over what other typings they may potentially be in, and what other Primarchs might fit into that typing. Without any further delays, let's start with one of the easiest Primarchs to assign, Mortarion. Poison is his bread and butter, his main shtick. What might his pairing be otherwise if poison was not an option? I'm thinking, and this might come as a little shock to some, it'd probably be rock. Mort's entire personality is just being intransigent. He's set on the course he wants to go, but he's not immovable. He's not steel. He's not going to be intractable to the extreme. He's steadfast, sure, but with the proper persuasion and person wearing him down, like Horus, he's willing to change his mind. Are there any others? I think a fair one would be Bug. It's nearly inextricably linked to poison, which would be a real contender for him. Nurgle uses quite a bit of insectoid imagery, and that feels very apropos, very Mortarion. I could definitely see him being either fine or begrudgingly loving the disgusting insects. Imagine him being more like, I hate him, but he's also got this cuteness to him that I just can't help but love. As for the poison typing, this is a little trickier. The first one that comes to mind is Alfarius and Omegon. Their legion is entirely cloak and dagger, and poison goes hand in hand with assassinations. If we wanted to stray a little further from the literal, we can go with Lorgar, how his honeyed words poison the minds and cripple the Imperium with doubt and sedition. It also extends to the warp's poisonous attributes, how it slowly seeps and corrupts. This line of logic could be associated with Magnus, but it feels like it's stretching it a bit. However, if we're in the business of stretching, we can go with full symbolism and say Perturabo's personality. In some contentious depictions, and I'm the one contending it, it's toxic. As toxic as the fields of battle when he and his Iron Warriors besiege a place, leaving it a fetid, toxic swamp of death. Next is Magnus with Psychic. This one's on par with Mort in terms of its ease of selection and its almost uniqueness to any other primary type choice. I don't think anyone's going to be as close as Magnus in that he's intrinsically linked to this type. That being said, the only one who might even potentially be thought of in the same category would be Lorgar. Lorgar is very psychic. Everything he does just has this passive psychic element to it. It would be a secondary type for a lot of other Primarchs, but as their main primary typing, this one is in the realm of Magnus. Future Sight is actually a pretty decent theme among psychics in Pokemon, so Sanguinius or Conrad would definitely be runners-up for inheriting the psychic mantle if for some reason Magnus couldn't accept. For Magnus, where would he be if not psychic? I can think of a sort of descending order. Something like Dark or Ghost type might be where Magnus slots in first. Early on in Magnus's career, him and his Thousand Sons all have these little familiars, which are basically warp demons. And they seem like a similar connection to ghosts and, ghost Pokemon being misunderstood. Very similar to how he perceives his connection to the warp, people hating what they don't understand. The last two I'll mention will be potentially water and grass. Water I'll go into more detail later, but remember almost everything I say about it then will apply to Magnus. Grass is very tranquil, very focused on growth and internal change. I wonder if the fan perception of him might be applying a lens to my eyes, but from the books, from what I recall, before he turns chaotic, he seemed to desire peace and primarily learning about the world around him. On to Mag's favorite brother, Leman Russ. What can I say about Russ? He's not just a wolfman, he's a frozen wolfman. Walking, talking Nordic stereotype from a Viking ice planet, entirely covered in wolf and ice iconography. Now don't get me wrong, I don't mind the ice swords or wolf helms. That's all fine with me. It's very straightforward and you mostly normally know where you stand with Russ. There might be some complexity under the surface, but him being a relatively known entity is fine. Good even. I think obviously ice would be his element. Thematically it works, it's a great offensive type, it's one of the only things that's super effective against dragons, and he's the Emperor's executioner after all. But it's terrible defensively, it's super weak to a ton, and the Wolfgang later is pretty vulnerable to large-scale losses due to their trouble with their genes and recruitment. The real question is, what else would he be if not ice? What is he? We know he likes to scrap, he exchanged blows with the lion, setting up a whole tradition. And later, he fought Angron just to prove a point. Fighting seems right in this dude's wheelhouse. One thing that feels contradictory to his aesthetic, but true to his character, is fire. It's very in-your-face, fast, hard, and leaves a savage wound. Arcanine would probably be the Pokemon of choice if he were to be the fire-type gym leader. That makes sense to me. Let me know in the comments if you can think of something different for him, or if you think any of what I said sounded like bull. Let's move on to see what other brother can embody ice, if not for Mr. Ice Wolf himself. I think a very clear choice would be Dorn, being from Inuit. Close to, Inuit. He's got a very icy personality. He seems very cold and standoffish. It's also deceptively strong. I don't know about you, but when I think of ice, I think of a large, massive blocks, huge mountains of sort of defensive element. But in reality, it's sharp and it burns, and boy does it do a lot of damage. Much like Dorn. Perturabo maybe, with his cold, calculating nature. If we really want to do away with a type disadvantage, maybe the Lion. He's a very cold Primarch, and what I love about Ice, especially in role-playing games, is its versatility. Being water solidified, it could be a weapon, blunt or sharp. It could be defensive, large, super cold structures which can absorb damage and quickly be healed by more water, like an organic body. And it can be ad hoc utilized. Need a quick set of stairs? The ice magic will conjure some. Need to make a diorama to plan an attack? Little ice sculptures are made with the snap of some fingers. Need a defensive aura to stop attackers and an offensive enchantment to cripple your foes? Ice mages, and they're buffing your equipment. That sort of utility seems right up the Lion's alley. With his specialized wings of troops and his weird innate defense against the warp and his intuitive swordsmanship offense, the man can do everything. Who's next? Angron, of course. Boy oh boy, I wonder what the angry red man's gonna be. Fighting type seems pretty cut and dry. He's the most outwardly aggressive Primarch. He's got the butcher nails, they turn him into a fighting machine. And I think the Pokemon would be a reflection of that. They're frothing at the mouth, barely contained, almost attacking the other trainer after they defeated the Pokemon they're fighting. I think it'd be an interesting contrast to see that as opposed to how we usually see fighting types portrayed. We usually see them cool and calm and collected, more put together and considered than any of the other Pokemon. If you think back to Gen 1 with Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, that whole gym area, or maybe the Elite Four fighting dude, all of the Pokemon are calm and he seems put together. I think it's something good for the kids, setting a good example so they don't go beating each other up like jerks. Now, what else would Angron be if not fighting? I do think arguments could be made for Russ work equally true for Angron. Fire being ferocious, and his color works too. Red. He's the Red Angel, of course. Now, I don't like using steel weapons because, it fits for almost every single Primarch. But, I think there's a little bit more to be considered with Angron than anyone else. His connections to steel in particular. Angron has those chain weapons that are a deep part of his character. Him giving whatever that chain axe was to his Karn the Betrayer, and him having two separate weapons. I think he beat the hell out of a Slaneshi demon, turned that into a weapon. That seems very steel. I could see him working with that. Dragon might be a little too regal for Angron, but he's certainly ferocious enough. And I think Fairy might not be too far off for him. I see with the empathy, who he is at his core with his emotions, seems kind of connected with the Fairy typing. And you can also see something like that with the, maybe some of the normal Pokemon have this too, to where on the outwardly it's very cute, it's very nice, and on the inside there could be little tiny demons. And the opposite would be true for Angron. It'd be a cute little ironic thing. For the fighting type, we've already mentioned Russ, but I think potentially Jagatai Khan in the traditional way fighting Pokemon were portrayed. Jagatai Khan has a lot more speed, very Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan, rather than Machamp, who's all strength. I think maybe Horus, actually, of all people. Sure, he's got a lot of charisma going for him, but they're always the spear tip. His whole legion always felt like fighting bros. The warrior lodges felt like they fit. With just the sort of general themes of them. They weren't, the lunar wolves weren't so much a stereotype. The stereotype of them wasn't so explicit. It really felt like a bunch of just gangs coming together to be a more organized militia rather than, space Vikings. And on to the last incredibly obvious choice. We're going with Vulcan and fire. Shock! He's named after a fire god, the Roman version of the Greek god Hephaestus, the god of forge and flame. Vulcan is one of the few Primarchs that feel like they have a soft side, close enough to the surface, so fairy seems within the realm of possibility. Also, the dichotomy between his hard, horrifying visage and the cuteness inherent to the type, I think it's pretty funny. Once again, steel rears its head, since the true artisan of the Primarchs, he really does care for the craft, and a lot of his war gear really accentuates on the specialness of it all. And let's not forget the obvious connection between the salamanders and dragons. The salamanders were previously known as the Dragon Warriors, so it's on the nose. But who else might we consider for fire? We already mentioned Angron and Russ, but I think Horus for his directness. His use of the fierce spear tip tactic. He'd hit fast, he'd hit hard. And it feels right. I think potentially Perturabo might also fit, with his use of siege tactics and artillery to obliterate fortresses, leaving them in smoldering ruins. Let's move on to the middling difficulty. This is where the typing is not super easy and or the Primarchs just kind of fall through process of elimination. Sanguinius starts us off with flying, our good old bird boy. Sang falls in here primarily because he's the only Primarch with wings, and the other Primarchs sort of have an affinity for flying, have edgier paths available to them. I wasn't planning on going into what type he would be, but it's surprisingly tough to think about offhand. He's arguably one of, if not the best melee combatant, so fighting was on the table, and he's also the runner-up for the most charismatic and kind Primarchs, so he's right next to Vulcan and Fairy's runner-up station. His versatility is also matched by his flying type, since there are nearly no pure flying types, but loads of primary and secondary flyers. And after our first middle section, we move on to the contentious section. But wait, CO, I hear you cry, you've only done one. Yes, well, when first writing down, I realized I had put the same typing for 2 Primarchs, and upon further review, I noticed a new crossover with the third, which then expanded into 2 others, which I had thought had solidified, and, well, it turned into this graph. While accurate, this Venn diagram is a mess, so I think the best way to organize my thoughts here are to go type by type and give arguments for why one would qualify more than the other. Starting with rock, my first impulse was the lion. I mean, he snoozed away in the rock, he's rock solid enough that he's the Emperor's fixer, and he seems the type to throw small rocks at his lesser brothers with impunity. But then I considered Dorn. There is an audio drama called Perturabo, Stone and Iron, where Dorn and his Imperial fists are the titular stone in question. They are strong and last the test of time. In double-checking the name of the audio drama, I stumbled upon a Reddit post which put thoughts I share succinctly. I'm quoting user TurkMC or Turk. Quote, Dorn, on the other hand, is unflinching. Like stone, it does not bend. Dorn never let up. He stood stalwart the entire crusade, shouldering the burden and never faltered where others have, like Perturabo. For the most part of the crusade and early Horus Heresy, Dorn stands taller than his counterpart, unbending, unbroken. Stone is hard, it will not bend, it breaks. And look at the rocky Pokemon in question. They are like Golem, Nosepass, Tyranitar, slow, plodding, defensive creatures. Dorn and the Imperial Fists are the most notable for their stalwart defenses and fortifications. So if we're kicking the lion out of the rock, and let's be honest, it's been long enough, where would the lion go? Well, the lion grew up in the forests of Caliban surrounded by nature. Not extremely thematic on his own, but with his return in modern lore, we see him traveling through some kind of warp forest. Along with that, grass types as a whole generally have pretty even stats across the board, even if they aren't exemplary like the Dark Angels. That being said, stretching it a little bit, you could see them as being second best in every aspect. All A tiers instead of, S tier. Jack of all trades, master of none, but oftentimes better than master of one, and that fits the lion and the Dark Angels to a T. Jagged Tycon as a grass type feels right more than anything in particular. Maybe it's all the Pokemon with Razor Leaf, maybe it's the idea of them riding on a grassy plain. Maybe I could just imagine the wind blowing through the grass and through all of his son's hair. I'll admit it's a bit of a stretch, but the vibes of his calm, fierce attitude felt right, and it was also the only remaining spot he fell during an earlier rotation of the list. And in truth, that was before I thought of what's to come next. Electricity. This goes pretty hand in hand with steel. There were some of the hardest determinations I had. The Iron Hands versus the Iron Lords. On one Iron Hand, Ferris. The dude literally has metal arms and weirdly relatively small arm art. I don't know why they do that. His Legion feels more electric than Perturabo's. The Iron Hand's close ties to the Mechanicus and their seemingly more advanced tech is more appropriate, where the Iron Lords feel very steel. It's obviously not analog, but compare the aesthetic of the depiction with the weird sort of World of Warcraft-like gears and everything, and how more efficient it looks. The huge problem I have is that no matter what argument I could think of, Perturabo's bodyguards of actual robots, his top-tier Terminator suit, his ability to nearly be a machine when he's locked in during space battles, I find it hard to give it to him over, the Iron Man with steel hands, Ferris Manus, Iron Hand. Okay, fine. That's okay though, right? I mean, it's not dissing Perturabo, right? Electric is super strong. And fast. And oh god, not nearly sturdy at all. And dear god, how could I forget the White Scar Sigil is a literal lightning bolt? Yeah, okay, thinking about it at first glance, it didn't make the obvious connection for Con and Electric. I mean, they fit so much better together. I was collecting some speed data, and I bumped him off of Grass for the Lion. And in the top fastest Pokemon, excluding Megaforms and Deoxys, Electric had the greatest representation. So that's what they get. And sure, that's cool with Con, but where does that leave Perturabo? Here we move on to Ground. I've made it no secret, I don't like Perturabo's characterization only based around his juxtaposition to Dorn. He's his own man. But once again, Ground does it. The distinction always seemed weird to me. As a kid, I didn't even realize they were different, Ground and Rock. But if we look at it, it fits pretty well. Ground Pokemon are fairly strong, with formidable defense. Like Perturabo saying, hard pass. To Nurgle and Chaos as a whole, it says hard no to electric moves, being immune to them. And much like the Iron Lords, many ground Pokemon are way underrated. As a kid, I was like a wee little Horus, using my ground Pokemon to just spam Earthquakes until everything I fought against died. Those Earthquakes, I feel, are a very appropriate stand-in for the earth-shaking artillery that the Iron Lords utilize. I know all of you are like me, and your first thought for Jagatai-Con wouldn't have been ground, but those Pokemon are surprisingly fast. They're just out of the top 10 in speed, but make decent placement in the top 20. That plus Sandslash working with those claws gave me serious consideration. In my first list, I originally had Dorn as ground, considering the split in styles between his chapters, and the Lion was in the running for all the reasons I mentioned above, and honestly because it seemed like he was going to fall down in between the cracks, kind of like Sanguinius with flying. But here we have our answers: Rock with Dorn, Grass with the Lion, Electric with Jagatai-Con, Steel with Ferris Manus, and Ground with Perturabo. Moving on to a less challenging crowd: Alfarius, Corvus, Thetis, Conrad, and Omegon, the Covert Ops trio. The typing in question are Darkness, Bug, and Ghost. This at first glance seems easy enough. To anyone versed in Conrad's ramblings, there's a wonderful quote. He sneered, gnawing at his skin until blood ran. I'll tell you why. Envy of his mastery lay behind my hatred. I haunted the night, but Korax owned it. Breath hissed through dagger teeth. He owned it! My stupid, short-sighted sons thought the Raven's abilities came from the technology given only to the 19th. I saw that it was innate. Imagine what I could have done had you given the same gifts to me. How much more perfect a monster I would have been had the shadows loved me as much as they loved Korax. That seems like a stunning endorsement to assign Corvus to Darkness. The man and his sons meld into the shadows in such a way that it makes other Marines, other Primarchs, envious. But there is an argument to be made that Ghost is just as fitting for that ability to meld into the shadows. Ghost Pokemon like Yamask and Galarian Corsola are explicitly melancholy, but there is this permeating sense of sadness or ennui in the small, usually cuter Pokemon, due to them, being ghost kids. And child mortality and sadness go with Corvus like Alfarius and personality disorders. Speaking of him, those three guys really have a problem on their pair of hands, because yes, their people meld into crowds like ghosts meld into walls, and yes, they're like Quicksilver when anyone tries to grasp their motives or when physical Pokemon try to strike ghosts with fighting moves, but their deeds are totally shrouded in darkness. Metaphorically, they are the most hidden and dark Primarch/Legion pair. Legion. But outside of Ghost, Bug-type has the largest crossover with Poison, which is just the type of assassinations the Alpha Legion specializes in. Bugs are also generally considered the weakest non-normal type, and thus the most covert and overlooked. Speaking of overlooked, the Night Lords in all their maniacal glory are very much like the other Primarchless Legion, the Iron Hands, in that they are considered less often than their brothers, and that feels very appropriate for Bugs. I mean, sure, they have an obvious range of emotion that feels like it would fit Corvus better, both melancholy and ironically happy, but let's not forget the sheer amount of pointy bits Bug have in their design. Think about the amount of physical damage Conrad could do with just one of those pointy Pokemon. Not as a partner, but as a physical tool to scar another living being. It would be horrifying. Bugs also evoke a sense of unease and fear in others, which is, the Night Lord's whole thing. Sure, ghost Pokemon are like the king of Spooksville, but not by much, and they seem more preoccupied with being dead or spooking people for the lulz, rather than outright maliciousness. That is the domain of darkness, and if this was purely an aesthetic conversation, Conrad gets darkness all day. Listen, I can't in good conscience not give Corvus the typing with Murkrow, but the more I look at Puccia, Houndoom, and good lord Malamar, the more I want to change my mind. But the picks would be Dark Corvus, Bug Conrad, and Ghost Alpharius. Moving on to the last and potentially hardest choices. In the running we have Roboot Gilliman, Lorgar Aurelian, Horus Lupercal, and the artist formerly known as Fulgrim. And they're each contending for the typing of Normal, Water, Dragon, and Fairy. This is a very strange and skewed list that feels like that IQ meme where the gut base reaction is the same as the studied high IQ reaction, with many arguments in between for each. But I think it might be easiest to go with the least contentious choice first and explain what that pairing is even doing here. That being Fulgrim and Fairy type. Cue the easiest gay joke in the comments about how effeminate he is and the strange things he does to his men. But beyond those surface aesthetic choices, which are fair, I think the strength of Fairy type is belied by its cutesy exterior, and it's very much like the Emperor's Children. Sure, they have a reputation for having concerns other than war, but that is just because, at their core, they are perfectionists in every way. I don't see them compared to the Dark Angels basically ever, but honestly they seem the most comparable. They're both generalists that exceed in almost everything they do. The difference to me is that it seems like the Dark Angels use their structure as a force multiplier. At least for me, that's kind of the feeling I get of their characters. It's not really a good sourced argument. Where the Emperor's Children come across as superb individuals, kind of like Custodes. I also like the typing advantage on fighting Dragon and Darkness, as those seem like core components of Chaos, and the idea of Clone Grim, Fabius Bile's clone of Fulgrim with maybe his original soul, who knows, eventually coming back as the prodigal son to lead the fight against Chaos after their lame fall, just feels right. And as you all know, you've watched all of my videos, this channel goes off of feels and vibes. So why is he here and not at the beginning section with all the easy choices? Well, that's because I can see Lorgar and to a lesser extent Horus as the deceptively soft fairy type, only to be found to be one of the largest major threats of exceedingly terrible power. If those were the case, I could see Fulgrim as a generic normal type, especially since there are plenty of cute/regal Pokemon there that I could absolutely see good Fulgrim being the champion of. Buckle up because the last three swirl in symbolism and meaning. Water, representing fluidity and adaptation, could as easily be the Ultramarines as it could be the swirling change of chaos for Lorgar, or as English poet William Blake thought of the classical elements of water as pertaining to doubt and jealousy, which fit Lorgar and Horus. For those two, dragons in Western tradition being chaos personified fits to a T, where it leans towards Horus in the traditional aspect of ultimate power and authority. But in Eastern traditions, dragons symbolize supernatural power, strength, and most of all wisdom, which, hate the blue man all you want, but he's nothing if not wise. Not to mention them being poster boys for a while, the Ultramarines, the greatest of them all, had it feeling, fitting that they'd be the strongest type dragons. Even if not technically true, it'd kind of be funny being a fitting poke to that era and its ridiculous feats. Normal type fit each of them all for different reasons. For the Ultramarines, I could see it fitting their Legion's strengths, not specifying in one, but through teamwork and the best logistics overcoming most things. If anyone could make do with normal, it would be them. Imagine Whitney and Jodo on steroids, and that's how I thought of the G-Man. For Horus, I can see it not so much making more out of less, but just grinding them to oblivion. He would be the first found and thus had the most time and experience. I can see his Pokemon, even in pre-post game, being exceedingly high leveled with the strongest attacks and status effects they could get. Also, he seems the only person I can imagine changing types. Think about having a gym battle with him, a grueling normal type slog, only for him to immediately fight you again with a stronger dragon, dark, psychic team. It feels very Horus, like a switch to chaos. Lorgar, the weakest of the brothers, even more so than the specialists, looked down on and underappreciated, like the normal typing itself. There are a few particular Pokemon I could see that totally match his aesthetic and themes from within his maligned typing. With all of that considered, it'll be like I said. The impulse will beat the thought-out reason, because the ultimate thought-out reason will lead you right back to your impulse, baby. Yes, Gilliman will be water because he is blue. Like water. Water is blue. Rabute is blue. It's like poetry. It rhymes. But in reality, its ubiquity and sheer variety and the quantity of Pokemon, alongside its versatility and near equal, if not spectacular stats, on average, make water the ultra choice for the Ultramarines. Normal Pokemon will go with Lorgar, who will seethe with what they deserve. A bunch of nondescript, forgettable Pokemon. Paired with some of the coolest guys around, like Pidgeot, Snorlax, and Exploud, and many more who symbolize their unseen value in psychic potential and general attunement to the wisdom of the universe and how the warp works. They don't need special typing because Pokemon are special enough, and they understand that. And Horus, Chaotic Betrayer Lupercal, gets dragons. Easily the strongest typing for War Master, as he is respected amongst his brothers for good reason. And for now, I must bid you adieu. Expect further videos on who I would pick for each Primarch as gym leader and their personal choices in Pokemon. Leave a comment letting me know who you think would have what and your reasoning in particular. Half for the algorithm nonsense, but the other half because I really want to know. I usually interact quite a bit in my comments, and probably going to interact with almost every comment on here. If you don't want to do that, like and subscribe. It helps my videos get out there, and it just, that sort of interaction makes me want to make more, so I appreciate it. Either way, thanks for watching. See you.
Magnus, the red psychic might, his eloquence and casting spells so bright, Vulcan charm.